updated for the MS-102 skills measured as of April 28, 2026. This MS-102 practice exam contains 45 expert-level questions. Read each scenario paragraph first, isolate the operational constraints, and choose the answer that satisfies every requirement. After the options, you will hear "lock in your answer." Then you get exactly 3 seconds of silence. Pause if you need more time. The reveal includes the complete correct answer, a concise explanation, and the full exam clue. Linked case context is read once and remains visible for its 3-question packet. Question 1 of 45. Contoso must replace the department value for 4,800 existing cloud-only users from an HR exported CSV. The file contains each user's user principal name and new department. Duplicate rows and stale user principal name values are possible, so the run must record failures without abandoning later rows. The operator must not receive permission to manage groups, applications, or tenant configuration. Which implementation best meets the requirements? Option A. Assign global administrator to the operator temporarily and run set msol user for every row without first resolving the target users. Option B. Use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center's bulk user create template and populate user principal name and department for all existing users. Option C. Connect to Microsoft Graph with delegated user.readupdate.all, update each user with update mguser-department, and verify the resulting department values. Option D. Connect to Microsoft Graph PowerShell with directory.readwrite.all. Build one directory object update request containing every row, and retry the complete request if any user is not found. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Connect to Microsoft Graph with delegated user.readupdate.all, update each user with update mguser-department, and verify the resulting department values. For non-admin user targets, the delegated workflow has 2 independent authorization layers. The Graph client needs the least privileged user.readupdate.all delegated permission for the supported user property update, and the signed-in operator needs an Entra role authorized to update other users, which the stem supplies as user administrator. The runbook should update each object, preserve per-user evidence, and verify the resulting values rather than relying on one process exit code. For a bulk change to existing objects, combine the narrow API permission for that object type with idempotent target resolution and per-record error capture. A CSV is an input format, not itself a safe bulk transaction. Question 2 of 45. Fabricam needs continuous cloud discovery coverage for internet traffic that exits through 2 supported perimeter firewalls. The traffic includes managed endpoints, unmanaged contractor devices, printers, and lab systems. Security engineers can deploy a Linux host beside each firewall, but firewall logs must remain inside the corporate network until they are sent to Microsoft. A one-time sample log upload parsed successfully. What should the administrator configure next? Option A. Define each firewall format, deploy a log collector on each Linux host, and forward each firewall's logs to its collector. Option B. Enable Defender for endpoint integration and treat its endpoint discovered application data as complete coverage for every device using the firewalls. Option C. Create an app connector for each firewall vendor and grant the connector access to the firewall's local log directories. Option D. Schedule repeated manual uploads of compressed firewall logs and classify each upload as a snapshot report. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Define each firewall format, deploy a log collector on each Linux host, and forward each firewall's logs to its collector. The successful sample establishes that the firewall format can be parsed, but it does not create continuous ingestion. Automatic log upload uses a configured data source, plus an on-premises Docker-based log collector. The network appliance forwards its traffic logs to that collector, which transfers them to Defender for Cloud Apps. This design covers traffic observed at the egress devices, including unmanaged and non-endpoint systems, while avoiding a requirement to stage firewall logs in an external service. Distinguish telemetry coverage from ingestion cadence. Endpoint integration sees onboarded endpoints. Snapshot upload proves parsing once, and a data source plus log collector turns perimeter logs into continuous discovery evidence. Question 3 of 45. Contoso's existing conditional access policy requires multi-factor authentication for all administrators. Sign-in logs show that password plus SMS satisfies the policy. The security board now requires phishing-resistant MFA for administrators accessing Microsoft admin portals, while ordinary users must continue using their current MFA methods. 2 emergency access accounts must remain available and are monitored separately. The administrator must validate the new control before enforcement and avoid weakening the existing MFA requirement. Which plan should be used? Option A. Configure PIM activation for the role to require authentication context C1, approval, and a justification. Option B. Edit the existing all administrator policy to require multi-factor authentication and mark SMS as phishing resistant, then exclude ordinary users. Option C. Create a sign-in frequency session control for Microsoft admin portals, exclude the emergency access accounts, and treat every fresh MFA prompt as phishing resistant. Option D. Enable security defaults so that administrators receive stronger prompts, and disable the existing conditional access policy during validation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Configure PIM activation for the role to require authentication context C1, approval, and a justification. The generic require multi-factor authentication grant control proves that an accepted MFA claim was present. It does not require a phishing-resistant method. Authentication strengths constrain which method combinations can satisfy conditional access. A separate policy preserves the current baseline while targeting the administrator roles and admin portal resource. And the built-in phishing-resistant MFA strength admits supported methods such as FIDO2 security keys, Windows Hello for Business, and certificate-based authentication in the supported configuration. Emergency access exclusions prevent lockout, and report-only evaluation supplies evidence before enforcement, without turning off the existing MFA policy. Require MFA answers, was MFA satisfied? Authentication strength answers, which MFA methods may satisfy it? Use report only on the new stricter layer while retaining the enforced baseline. Question 4 of 45. A central identity governance team must assign and remove Microsoft Entra directory roles for administrators and manage membership of role assignable groups. The team must not manage conditional access policies, application registrations, Exchange recipients, or SharePoint settings. Which Microsoft Entra built-in role should be assigned to the team's operators? Option A. Global Administrator. Option B. User Administrator. Option C. Groups Administrator. Option D. Privileged Role Administrator. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Privileged Role Administrator. Privileged Role Administrator is the least privileged built-in role designed to manage Microsoft Entra role assignments and role assignable groups. Those objects are deliberately protected from ordinary user and group administration because changing them can grant administrative control. The role meets the identity governance task without granting the broad, cross-service configuration authority of global administrator. When a group can carry a directory role, it crosses from ordinary group administration into privileged role governance. Select the role that controls role assignments, not merely users or groups. Question 5 of 45. Contoso has activated Microsoft Defender XDR Unified RBAC for all supported workloads. A new investigation team must investigate and manage Defender XDR alerts and incidents across those workloads, but must not change security settings. The same team must investigate Microsoft Purview DLP alerts and view the underlying DLP event data, but must not create or modify DLP policies. Which two permission assignments should the administrator make? Choose two. Option A. Activate Defender Unified RBAC for each workload that the role must govern. Option B. Add the team to the Microsoft Purview Data Loss Prevention role group. Option C. Add the team to an Exchange Online Organization Management role group and enable Unified RBAC inheritance. Option D. Assign the Microsoft Entra Security Administrator role to the team. Option E. Grant security data basics and alerts and scope each data source through its supported assignment model. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and E. Option A. Activate Defender Unified RBAC for each workload that the role must govern. Option E. Grant security data basics, read, and alerts, manage, and scope each data source through its supported assignment model. Defender Unified RBAC separates permissions, workload activation, and data scope. Security data basics, plus alerts, supplies incident and alert visibility and management. Each governed workload must be activated for Unified RBAC, and scope must be selected in the model supported by each data source. Defender for Endpoint device groups do not automatically scope every workload. Cross-portal investigation usually requires parallel grants in separate authorization planes. Scope Defender response permissions in Unified RBAC, then choose a Purview analyst role group whose included roles are view/investigation, not policy management. Question 6 of 45. A company is preparing an ADDS forest for its first synchronization to Microsoft Entra ID. The verified sign-in domain is fabricam.com, but 2,400 users have user principal name values ending in the non-routable suffix fabricam.local. Applications still use SAM account name, and the identity team has approved fabricam.com as the replacement UPN suffix. The team must make a reviewable source directory correction before enabling synchronization, and must avoid treating an authentication workaround as directory remediation. What should the administrator do? Option A. Configure alternate login ID in Microsoft Entra Connect Sync to use mail and leave every on-premises user principal name unchanged. Option B. Enable soft matching and create cloud-only users with fabricam.com UPNs before correcting ADDs. Option C. Use Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync with an agent in each forest. Each agent needs outbound HTTPS access to Microsoft Entra ID. Option D. Add fabricam.local as a Microsoft Entra custom domain, and verify it by publishing a DNS TXT record. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Use Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync with an agent in each forest. Each agent needs outbound HTTPS access to Microsoft Entra ID. The defect is an authoritative ADDS sign-in suffix that cannot be verified as a public Microsoft Entra domain. IDFix provides a pre-synchronization reviewable workflow. Query the directory, inspect the reported attribute and value, supply the approved routable replacement, and execute only accepted edits. Because fabricam.com is already verified and approved as the replacement, correcting the source before the first synchronization prevents the invalid suffix from becoming a cloud provisioning problem. The continued use of SAM account name by applications does not justify retaining an invalid synchronization value, and neither alternate sign-in configuration nor object matching repairs the source attribute. When the approved cloud sign-in suffix already exists, but ADDS uses a non-routable suffix, use IDFix as a query, review, execute source remediation workflow. Authentication and matching features do not cleanse attributes. Question 7 of 45. Contoso creates an administrative unit named Europe Operations and adds the region's security groups to it. A regional operator must create and delete groups in that administrative unit and manage their memberships, but must not administer groups elsewhere. The operator must also be unable to change tenant-wide group expiration settings. Which delegation should the identity administrator configure? Option A. Make the operator an owner of the Europe Operations Administrative Unit without assigning a directory role. Option B. Assign the group's administrator role to the operator with Europe Operations as the assignment scope. Option C. Assign the directory reader's role at Europe Operations scope and make the operator owner of every existing group in the unit. Option D. Assign the group's administrator role to the operator at tenant scope and use a naming policy to identify Europe groups. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Assign the group's administrator role to the operator with Europe Operations as the assignment scope. A Microsoft Entra role assignment scoped to an administrative unit constrains the supported role's object management authority to that unit. Group's administrator at Europe Operations scope supplies group creation, deletion, and membership management permissions for groups in scope, without granting equivalent authority over other tenant groups. An administrative unit scoped group's administrator also cannot manage tenant-level group settings such as expiration, which directly satisfies the negative requirement. The administrative unit is the authorization scope. A naming convention is not. An administrative unit limits where a supported directory role can act. It does not turn naming, container ownership, or read access into delegated administration, and scoped admins do not gain tenant-level settings authority. Question 8 of 45. 4 service desk leads have eligible authentication administrator assignments in Microsoft Entra PIM. Policy requires each activation to include a ticket number as justification, use phishing-resistant authentication, receive approval from either of 2 identity duty managers, and expire after 2 hours. No lead should hold the role while off shift. Which configuration meets the requirements with the least standing privilege? Option A. Convert the 4 assignments to permanent active assignments and use an access review every 30 days. Option B. Keep the assignments eligible and configure email notifications to both duty managers, because notification recipients must approve before activation completes. Option C. Make one duty manager permanently active as authentication administrator and have that manager assign and remove active roles for each shift. Option D. Target the pilot group in the authentication methods policy. Set FIDO2 key restrictions to allow. Add the approved AAG UIDs and enforce attestation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Target the pilot group in the authentication methods policy. Set FIDO2 key restrictions to allow. Add the approved AAG UIDs and enforce attestation. Eligible PIM assignments avoid standing role access. The role's activation settings can require justification, approval, and a maximum activation duration. Listing the 2 identity duty managers as approvers permits the approval workflow without granting them the target role merely to approve. A conditional access authentication context bound to an authentication strength policy can enforce the phishing-resistant authentication requirement during activation. The 2-hour limit automatically bounds the activated assignment. Notification alone is evidence and awareness, not an approval gate. In PIM, eligibility removes standing access. Activation settings impose justification, approval, authentication, and duration, while notification settings only report events and never substitute for approval. Question 9 of 45. A parent company already has a Microsoft 365 tenant. A divested business requires a legally isolated Microsoft 365 tenant with separate administrators, subscriptions, identities, and service configuration. Procurement is ready to purchase 3,000 licenses, but the purchase must not become associated with the parent's tenant. DNS migration will occur next quarter. What should the program administrator do first? Option A. Create a new Microsoft 365 tenant for the divested business. Establish its initial administrator and onmicrosoft.com namespace and purchase the subscriptions in that tenant. Add the custom DNS domain later. Option B. Add the divested business's future DNS domain to the parent tenant and use it as the boundary for separate subscriptions and administrators. Option C. Create an administrative unit in the parent tenant and assign global administrator at that administrative unit scope before purchasing the subscriptions. Option D. Purchase the subscriptions while signed in to the parent tenant, and then change their tenant association after the divestiture tenant is created. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Create a new Microsoft 365 tenant for the divested business. Establish its initial administrator and onmicrosoft.com namespace, and purchase the subscriptions in that tenant. Add the custom DNS domain later. The requirement is a separate Microsoft Entra / Microsoft 365 security and service boundary. So the target tenant must exist before tenant-bound subscriptions are purchased for it. Creating the tenant establishes its own initial namespace and administrator context. Procurement can then buy licenses while operating in that tenant. The custom domain is a post-creation dependency and can wait for the planned DNS migration. Domains and administrative units partition names or delegated object administration inside a tenant. Neither creates independent subscriptions, tenant-wide configuration, or a separate global administrator boundary. When legal and operational isolation requires separate identities, administrators, subscriptions, and tenant-wide settings, create the destination tenant before procurement. DNS domains and administrative units are scopes inside a tenant, not tenant substitutes. Question 10 of 45. Northwind Bio has one Microsoft 365 tenant and is absorbing a research company whose users remain in a separate ADDS forest. Northwind uses Microsoft Entra Connect Sync for its current forest and plans a separate Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync configuration for the acquired forest. The acquired company will adopt the verified custom domain, research.northwindbio.com, after identity provisioning is stable. Compliance has a DLP policy that audits transfers of regulated trial identifiers from Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and onboarded Windows devices. Investigators must preserve the distinction between aggregate trends, individual rule matches, and alert-level response evidence. A DLP alert groups several endpoint events for one user. The alert shows uploads to a browser, but the investigator must establish the exact file paths, matched sensitive information, device, and action for each underlying occurrence. The compliance lead separately needs a 30-day trend by policy and location to determine whether the spike is isolated or systemic. Which two actions provide the required evidence? Choose two. Option A. Use the DLP reports to review 30-day policy match trends and filter the results by location and policy. Option B. Resolve the alert as a false positive before examining its underlying events, then use the resolved alert count as the trend. Option C. Open the alert's Events tab and inspect the individual events and their details. Option D. Use Content Explorer to enumerate every item that currently contains the sensitive information type. Option E. Search the Microsoft Entra sign-in logs for the affected user and treat each successful sign-in as a DLP event. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and C. Option A. Use the DLP reports to review 30-day policy match trends and filter the results by location and policy. Option C. Open the alert's Events tab and inspect the individual events and their details. The alert is a response container that can aggregate related DLP events. Its Events view supplies occurrence-level evidence such as the activity, item, device, and match content context. DLP reports provide the separate aggregate view needed to compare policy matches over time and by workload or location. Using both views preserves the required evidence granularity before the investigator changes alert status. Keep DLP evidence levels separate. An alert groups a response case. Its events establish what happened per occurrence, and reports establish patterns over time. Question 11 of 45. The acquired forest cannot establish network connectivity to Northwind's Connect sync server. Security permits outbound-only HTTPS from 2 member servers in that forest, requires local agent redundancy, and prohibits storing the acquired forest's administrative credentials in the Northwind data center. Existing Northwind identities must continue through Connect Sync without a topology change. Which implementation best meets the connectivity, resilience, and synchronization boundary requirements? Option A. Add the acquired forest to the existing Connect Sync server and publish inbound TCP 445 and 389 from the internet to the Northwind data center. Option B. Install a second active Microsoft Entra Connect Sync server in the acquired forest and configure both Connect Sync servers to export the same Northwind objects. Option C. Install 2 Cloud Sync agents in the acquired forest and scope a Cloud Sync configuration to its required OUs. Leave Connect Sync unchanged. Option D. Install 1 Cloud Sync agent on a domain controller and configure Connect Sync staging mode on that agent for failover. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Install 2 Cloud Sync agents in the acquired forest and scope a Cloud Sync configuration to its required OUs. Leave Connect Sync unchanged. Cloud Sync uses lightweight provisioning agents with outbound connectivity and supports multiple agents for availability. A separate configuration can scope provisioning from the acquired forest, while Northwind's existing forest remains managed by Connect Sync. This satisfies the prohibited inbound path and avoids extending acquired forest credentials or overlapping authority into the existing Connect Sync deployment. Choose the synchronization engine from network and authority boundaries first. Outbound-only remote forests and redundant lightweight agents point to Cloud Sync, while staging mode belongs to Connect Sync. Question 12 of 45. The identity pilot succeeds. Northwind adds research.northwindbio.com to Microsoft 365, but verification remains pending. Public DNS is hosted by a third party. The DNS administrator created the Microsoft-provided TXT value at research.northwindbio.com with a 3600-second TTL. An external lookup instead returns that TXT value at northwindbio.com. No mailflow cutover is authorized yet. What should the administrator do next to complete ownership verification without changing production mail routing? Option A. Add research.northwindbio.com as an accepted domain in Exchange Online and rerun Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync. Option B. Replace the current MX record for research.northwindbio.com with the Microsoft 365 MX value, then verify the domain. Option C. Delete the subdomain entry and verify northwindbio.com because a TXT record at the parent automatically verifies every child domain. Option D. Move or recreate the Microsoft-provided verification TXT record at the exact research.northwindbio.com DNS name. Wait for DNS propagation and run verify again. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Move or recreate the Microsoft-provided verification TXT record at the exact research.northwindbio.com DNS name. Wait for DNS propagation, and run verify again. Microsoft 365 must find the supplied ownership token at the DNS name being verified. The external lookup proves that the token was published at the parent rather than the assigned subdomain, so correcting the TXT owner name and allowing propagation addresses the failure. A TXT verification record proves ownership without redirecting mail, preserving the no cutover constraint. When domain verification fails, compare the requested DNS owner name, not only the token value, and use TXT proof when mail routing must remain untouched. Question 13 of 45. Microsoft Entra Connect Sync completes scheduled cycles and reports no object synchronization errors, but newly approved group membership changes now take 70 minutes to appear in Microsoft Entra ID instead of the usual 10 minutes. The active server imports from two ADDS connectors and exports to Microsoft Entra ID. Operations needs centralized evidence showing whether import or export duration changed over time before opening an incident with the network team. Which Connect Health evidence should the administrator review first? Option A. Microsoft Entra sign-in logs for the users whose group memberships changed. Option B. Compare connector import and export latency for the active Connect Sync service across the affected period. Option C. The synchronization errors report filtered for duplicate attributes, even though all affected objects show successful synchronization. Option D. Microsoft 365 Service Health Advisories for Exchange Online message delivery. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Compare connector import and export latency for the active Connect Sync service across the affected period. The material symptom is increased end-to-end synchronization delay with successful cycles and no object errors. Microsoft Entra Connect Health exposes graphical synchronization latency trends for connector operations, such as imports and exports. Comparing those trends over the affected window can identify which operation became slower and provides the requested historical evidence before the team attributes the delay to a network path. Error reports answer which objects failed, while authentication and Microsoft 365 workload health evidence are from different operational layers. Successful but slow synchronization is a latency trend problem, not an object error problem. Use Connect Health operation trends to separate import delay from export delay before escalating a presumed dependency failure. Question 14 of 45. Cloud Discovery shows a sharp increase in uploads to an unsanctioned generative AI service. The Discovery snapshot came from continuously uploaded firewall logs and identifies users and traffic volume, but it does not identify the files involved. All corporate Windows devices are onboarded to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and network protection is enabled in block mode. Security must preserve the discovery evidence, formally record the app decision, and stop access from those onboarded devices with the least additional deployment. What should an analyst do? Option A. Export the discovery evidence, mark the app unsanctioned, and enforce its app domain indicators through Defender for Endpoint. Option B. Create a Defender for Cloud Apps file policy for the service and select governance action quarantine every uploaded file. Option C. Delete the continuous log collector so Cloud Discovery stops reporting the app. Then add the app to the Microsoft Entra application gallery. Option D. Mark the app as sanctioned and create an OAuth app policy that revokes every user's consent to the service. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Export the discovery evidence, mark the app unsanctioned, and enforce its app domain indicators through Defender for Endpoint. Cloud Discovery log evidence supports the risk and usage decision, but does not provide file-level control for an unmanaged discovered service. Marking the app unsanctioned records the governance decision. With Defender for Endpoint integration and network protection already in block mode, the app's domain indicators can enforce the block on onboarded devices without another network appliance rollout. Exporting first preserves the review evidence. Cloud Discovery establishes shadow IT usage. Sanction or unsanction records the decision, while actual blocking requires an enforcement path such as Defender for Endpoint, not file governance inferred from traffic logs. Question 15 of 45. AdventureWorks is designing one custom sensitive information type for export authorization records. A valid record contains a bounded identifier in the form EX followed by exactly 8 digits. To reduce false positives, the identifier must occur near at least one phrase from a centrally maintained set, such as export authorization, destination control, or consignee certification. The policy team must be able to update that phrase set without editing the identifier pattern. Match each design requirement to the custom sensitive information type element that should implement it. Each target may be used once. Some targets are not used. Requirements. R1. Detect the structurally bounded EX hopel identifier as the primary element. R2. Maintain the approved corroborating phrases as one reusable collection. R3. Require a phrase from that collection near the identifier to raise confidence. Targets. T1. The keyword list used as a supporting element within the proximity window. T2. Keyword list containing the approved phrases. T3. Trainable classifier. T4. Regular expression used as the primary element. T5. Document fingerprint. Lock in your answer. The complete correct mapping is R1 maps to T4. Detect the structurally bounded EX backesting identifier as the primary element. Maps to regular expression used as the primary element. R2 maps to T2. Maintain the approved corroborating phrases as one reusable collection. Maps to keyword list containing the approved phrases. R3 maps to T1. Require a phrase from that collection near the identifier to raise confidence. Maps to the keyword list used as a supporting element within the proximity window. A regular expression is the deterministic primary match for the fixed EX plus 8-digit structure and can include boundaries to prevent substring matches. A keyword list centralizes the approved corroborating phrases. Referencing that list as a supporting element within the sensitive information type's proximity window makes a nearby phrase evidence for the required confidence level, while allowing the phrase collection to be maintained independently of the identifier regex. Decompose a custom sensitive information type into syntax, maintained vocabulary, and confidence evidence. Regex finds the variable token. A keyword list owns the vocabulary, and a supporting element proximity rule connects them. Question 16 of 45. Contoso's Secure Score recommends blocking a legacy authentication path. The path remains enabled in Microsoft 365 because one regulated workflow still depends on it. A separately licensed third-party access proxy already intercepts every request to that path and enforces certificate-based authentication. The security team has test results and proxy logs proving coverage, and it wants Secure Score to reflect the implemented control without claiming that Microsoft can verify the proxy. Which response to the improvement action is most accurate? Option A. Mark the action resolved through alternate mitigation because every compensating control, including third-party software, is an internal alternate mitigation. Option B. Mark the action resolved through third-party and attach the test evidence and implementation notes. Option C. Mark the action risk accepted because the Microsoft 365 setting itself remains enabled. Option D. Mark the action completed because the third-party proxy produces equivalent security evidence. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Mark the action resolved through third party and attach the test evidence and implementation notes. The recommendation is not completed in the Microsoft control plane, but the documented requirement is covered by third-party software. Resolved through third party is therefore the precise status. That status awards the action's points so the score can reflect the external control, while explicitly recognizing that Microsoft has no visibility into whether the third-party implementation is complete. Attaching the test evidence and implementation notes preserves the organization's basis for the status and supports later reassessment if the proxy or workflow changes. Secure Score status records how an improvement action was addressed. Use completed for the recommended implementation, third party for external software, alternate mitigation for an internal compensating control, and risk accepted, when residual risk is deliberately left untreated. Question 17 of 45. Fabricam has 8,000 users on standard release. Change management wants 35 product owners and the internal help desk to evaluate user-scoped Microsoft 365 features before broad availability. All other users must remain on standard release. The pilot must not be represented as proving features that Microsoft deploys only at organization scope. What should a global administrator configure? Option A. In Message Center Preferences, add the product owners as major update recipients and treat message receipt as early feature access. Option B. Select Targeted Release for everyone, then use Microsoft Entra administrative units to exclude all users except the pilot group. Option C. In Settings, Org Settings, Organization Profile, Release Preferences, select Targeted Release for selected users, and add the product owners and help desk users. Option D. Keep Standard Release and assign the pilot users Microsoft 365 Apps Current Channel, Preview, which places every Microsoft 365 cloud service in Targeted Release for those users. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. In Settings, Org Settings, Organization Profile, Release Preferences, select Targeted Release for selected users and add the product owners and help desk users. Release Preferences in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center's Organization Profile can place selected users in Targeted Release while leaving the rest of the tenant on Standard Release. Including the help desk is operationally important because support staff need access to the user scope changes they must support. The boundary in the stem also matters. Some features roll out only per organization, so selected user targeted release cannot expose those features early and must not be used as evidence that they were tested. Microsoft documents Global Administrator as the role required to opt in. Separate Cloud Service Release Preferences from Communications and Desktop App Update Channels. Selected User Targeted Release creates a user pilot, but it cannot force early delivery of organization-scoped features. Question 18 of 45. A Defender XDR incident contains a phishing alert for a message delivered to alex@contoso.com at 0912 and an endpoint alert for suspicious PowerShell on PC 447 at 0929. Automatic correlation did not establish whether Alex used that device. The incident evidence identifies the recipient and device, but contains no common alert identifier. An analyst must use advanced hunting to produce defensible cross-service evidence for or against the relationship, without assuming that two events in the same incident share identifiers. Which approach is best? Option A. Establish delivery in email events, establish the user's device sessions in device logon events, and correlate device process events by device, account, and time. Option B. Union email events and device process events, summarize by timestamp, and treat records in the same 1-hour bin as proof that the recipient launched the process. Option C. Query alert info twice and interjoin the results on alert ID, because all alerts grouped into one Defender XDR incident inherit one common alert ID. Option D. Filter email events for Alex and device process events for PC 447. Then join the tables on network message ID because that identifier is populated for endpoint processes launched after email delivery. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Establish delivery in email events. Establish the user's device sessions in device logon events. And correlate device process events by device, account, and time. The investigation must bridge evidence at its real pivots rather than invent a cross-workload key. Email events establishes the recipient and delivery chronology. Device logon events can show whether Alex had an account session on PC 447, while device process events supplies the process, initiating account, device, and timestamp evidence. Correlating normalized account context and device ID or device name within a justified time window can support or refute the hypothesized relationship, while preserving each event's timestamp and identifiers for review. The result is correlation evidence, not automatic proof of user intent, so contradictory logon or process ownership must also be retained. In cross-service hunting, pivot through entities the telemetry can actually prove: recipient, account session, device, process, and bounded time, not through an assumed universal alert or message identifier. Question 19 of 45. Contoso's messaging on-call administrator needs email when a new Exchange Online incident affects the tenant and whenever that incident's status changes. The administrator must not receive SharePoint advisories. A current Exchange incident is already open, and a second operations mailbox must receive updates for that issue only. Which configuration satisfies both notification scopes without creating tenant-wide mail flow automation? Option A. Create an Exchange Online transport rule that redirects messages sent by Microsoft to the two mailboxes and suppresses messages whose subject contains advisory. Option B. Customize the Service Health dashboard to show only Exchange Online. Dashboard filtering automatically emails both addresses for every visible issue. Option C. Configure Message Center preferences for Exchange Online major updates and add both addresses, because Message Center subscriptions include incident status changes. Option D. In the administrator's Service Health email preferences, enable incident notifications for Exchange Online and enter the on-call address. On the current issue, use Manage Notifications for this issue and add the operations mailbox. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. In the administrator's Service Health email preferences, enable incident notifications for Exchange Online and enter the on-call address. On the current issue, use Manage Notifications for this issue and add the operations mailbox. Service Health email preferences can be scoped by issue type and service, so the administrator can request incident, not advisory notifications for Exchange Online, and receive both new incident and active incident status updates. An individual active issue also exposes managed notifications for this issue, allowing the operations mailbox to subscribe only to that event. Microsoft permits up to 2 email addresses for each preference or issue subscription, with the preference limit applied per administrator account. These controls operate at the health event layer and do not require mail flow rules. Service Health has separate view, broad preference, and single issue scopes. A dashboard filter changes display, service/type email preferences cover future and changing events, and manage notifications for this issue follows one active event. Question 20 of 45. The Microsoft Defender for Endpoint Device Health report shows 2 distinct regressions after a network change. 40 Windows devices moved from active to impaired communications immediately after egress filtering was enabled. A different set of active devices reports current sensor health, but an old Microsoft Defender antivirus security intelligence version. No active incident links the 2 populations. Which 2 actions address the report evidence at the correct layers? Choose 2. Option A. Create one suppression rule for the old intelligence version and impaired communications, because suppressing the report findings remediates their common incident root cause. Option B. Resolve the issue by changing both populations to active in the device health report, because report state is an administrator-maintained classification. Option C. For the impaired communications population, validate Defender for Endpoint service connectivity and proxy or firewall access. Then confirm that fresh sensor telemetry reaches the portal. Option D. For the stale intelligence population, validate the configured security intelligence update source and trigger or schedule an update. Then verify the reported version advances. Option E. Isolate every impaired device from the network until communications becomes active, because isolation restores the Defender sensor's cloud channel. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are C and D. Option C, for the impaired communications population, validate Defender for Endpoint service connectivity and proxy or firewall access, then confirm that fresh sensor telemetry reaches the portal. Option D, for the stale intelligence population, validate the configured security intelligence update source and trigger or schedule an update, then verify the reported version advances. The report exposes two different health dimensions, and the evidence does not establish one incident or cause. Impaired communications after an egress change points to the sensor-to-service communication path. So the team should test the documented Defender service connectivity and network configuration, and then verify new telemetry. Devices whose sensor remains healthy but whose antivirus security intelligence is old require remediation of the antivirus update source or update process, followed by version evidence. The actions are independent and may be performed in either order. Each closes the loop against the report dimension that identified it. Treat Defender reports as measured layers, not tickets to relabel. Sensor communication failures call for service channel diagnostics, while stale antivirus content calls for update source remediation and version verification. Question 21 of 45. A regulated company has validated a static Microsoft 365 retention policy in a pilot. The production policy must retain Exchange mailboxes and SharePoint sites for 10 years. After the policy is formally declared in force, even a compliance administrator must be unable to turn it off, delete it, remove included locations, or shorten its retention period. The company must still be able to add locations and extend retention if regulations change. Which implementation sequence meets the requirement? Option A. Create an e-discovery case hold for all locations and close the case after 10 years, because a case hold permanently prevents administrators from changing retention configuration. Option B. Publish a retention label that users cannot remove and rely on the label policy to prevent administrators from deleting the publishing policy. Option C. Apply preservation lock to the pilot policy first, and then change that locked policy's scope and retention duration to the production values. Option D. Create the production retention policy, verify its settings and locations, and then apply preservation lock to the policy before declaring it in force. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Create the production retention policy, verify its settings and locations, and then apply preservation lock to the policy before declaring it in force. Preservation lock is the control that makes a retention policy restrictive and irrevocable. After it is applied, no administrator can disable or delete the policy, reduce its retention period, or make its scope less inclusive. The policy can still be made more restrictive by extending retention or adding locations. Because the lock cannot be reversed, the administrator must first create and validate the final production policy, including its locations and retention settings, and only then lock it and place it in force. This sequence satisfies both the immutability requirement and the permitted future changes, without confusing item-level labels or litigation preservation with policy configuration immutability. When governance must prevent even privileged administrators from weakening a retention policy, finalize and validate first. Then use the irreversible preservation lock. Holds and item labels protect different scopes. Question 22 of 45. Microsoft Entra Connect Sync exports a user's department as sales, even though ADDS now contains corporate sales. The latest export cycle succeeded. No duplicate attribute error exists, and several custom inbound synchronization rules can contribute department with different precedence values. Operations must determine which source value and rule won in the metaverse before changing any configuration. What should the synchronization administrator do first? Option A. Run IDFix and accept every proposed change, because IDFix reports synchronization rule precedence conflicts in the metaverse. Option B. Edit the user's department directly in Microsoft Entra ID and run a delta synchronization cycle. Option C. Unblock the user in restricted entities, then allow for propagation, usually about 1 hour, but up to 24 hours. Option D. Put the active Connect sync server in staging mode and promote the staging server before examining either server's connector spaces. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Unblock the user in restricted entities, then allow for propagation, usually about 1 hour, but up to 24 hours. A successful export proves that Connect Sync wrote its calculated metaverse value. It does not prove that the intended inbound source or rule supplied that value. Synchronization Service Manager exposes the evidence chain needed here. The metaverse search and attribute lineage identify the connector and synchronization rule contributing department, while connector space preview can show how the object's inbound rules and precedents calculate the result without committing a change. The administrator can then correct the authoritative source or the specific rule after establishing causality. Cloud edits, broad directory cleansing, and server failover either target the wrong layer or alter state before evidence is collected. A successful sync with the wrong value is a lineage and precedence problem. Trace connector space to metaverse and preview rule calculation before editing the source, rules, cloud object, or active server role. Question 23 of 45. A company enables passkeys, FIDO2, for its privileged operations group. Security approves 2 hardware key models and records their authenticator attestation GUIDs, AA GUIDs. Administrators must be prevented from registering unapproved roaming security keys, not merely prevented from using them for one application. Existing approved keys must continue to work. Which authentication method configuration should the identity administrator apply? Option A. Enable temporary access pass for the group and set each pass to one-time use, because one-time bootstrap credentials restrict which FIDO2 authenticator can be registered. Option B. Create a conditional access authentication strength containing the 2 hardware key display names, and use it to block registration of every other key. Option C. Disable self-service password reset registration for the group, and configure a custom banned password list with the 2 unapproved key vendors. Option D. In the passkey FIDO2 authentication method, target the privileged operations group, enforce attestation, enable key restrictions, and use an allow list containing only the 2 approved AA GUIDs. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. In the passkey FIDO2 authentication method, target the privileged operations group, enforce attestation, enable key restrictions, and use an allow list containing only the 2 approved AA GUIDs. The authentication methods policy owns passkey registration and authenticator restrictions. Scoping passkeys to the privilege group, requiring attestation, and enabling key restrictions with an allow list of approved AA GUIDs constrains registration to authenticators whose attested model identifiers are approved. Existing keys from those models remain allowed. Conditional access authentication strengths govern which already registered methods can satisfy a sign-in. They do not provide the requested model-level registration gate. Password reset and bootstrap controls are separate layers and cannot validate a security key's authenticator model. Separate registration governance from sign-in enforcement. Authenticator model restrictions belong to the passkey method policy and use attestation plus AA GUID allow or block lists. Authentication strengths consume methods after registration. Question 24 of 45. A Defender XDR incident contains a suspicious domain and IP address associated with credential theft. Analysts must enrich both observables with current Microsoft threat intelligence, examine reputation and related infrastructure, and correlate any tenant sightings before recommending an indicator. They must not treat external attribution alone as proof that Contoso was affected. Which investigation plan best meets the requirement? Option A. Create an Intel project, invite collaborators, and treat the project relationship graph as proof that Contoso encountered every related observable. Option B. Enrich the domain and IP in Microsoft Threat Intelligence, then correlate local defender telemetry before proposing a scoped indicator. Option C. Add every related domain and IP to the tenant allow block list before checking tenant telemetry. Option D. Use Microsoft 365 Service Health to determine whether the threat actor affected Contoso and close the incident if no advisory exists. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Enrich the domain and IP in Microsoft Threat Intelligence, then correlate local defender telemetry before proposing a scoped indicator. Microsoft Threat Intelligence Entity Enrichment and Intelligence Explorer provide external reputation, relationships, articles, and infrastructure context for domains and IP addresses. Analysts must then correlate those findings with Defender XDR telemetry to establish tenant exposure before creating a narrowly scoped indicator. External attribution is intelligence, not proof of local impact, and retired Intel project collaboration semantics should not be used as a durable workflow. Threat intelligence enriches an observable. Defender telemetry proves whether your tenant encountered it. Keep attribution, local impact, and enforcement as separate decisions. Question 25 of 45. Litware has Microsoft 365 E5 and a hybrid identity deployment that uses Microsoft Entra Connect Sync with password hash synchronization. All employees use Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Teams. A pilot group named Secure Collab Pilot must receive new Defender for Office 365 controls before company-wide deployment. Security Operations wants policy behavior and alert evidence to remain independently tunable. For the pilot, users must be able to read an email body while an attachment is being detonated, but an attachment later found malicious must not remain available. URLs and email and Teams messages must be checked when clicked. Existing preset security policies are not assigned to the pilot group. Which two policy configurations meet the attachment delivery and click protection requirements for Secure Collab Pilot? Choose two. Option A. Create a safe attachments policy with the monitor action and rely on the resulting detections to retract malicious attachments. Option B. Create a safe links policy scoped to Secure Collab Pilot, enable time of click scanning for email links, and enable safe links protection for Teams. Option C. Create a mail flow rule that rewrites every URL and bypasses safe link scanning for messages delivered to Secure Collab Pilot. Option D. Create an anti-malware policy scoped to Secure Collab Pilot and enable common attachment filtering only. Option E. Create a safe attachments policy scoped to Secure Collab Pilot and select dynamic delivery. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and E. Option B. Create a safe links policy scoped to Secure Collab Pilot, enable time of click scanning for email links, and enable safe links protection for Teams. Option E. Create a safe attachments policy scoped to Secure Collab Pilot and select dynamic delivery. Dynamic delivery in a safe attachments policy delivers the message body with a placeholder while the attachment is scanned, then makes a clean attachment available. A malicious attachment is quarantined rather than delivered. SafeLinks supplies time-of-click URL checking, and its policy has a separate setting for Teams protection. Scoping both policies to Secure Collab Pilot provides the requested stage deployment. These are independent controls, so selecting both does not imply an answer order. Translate the user experience into the policy action. An immediately readable body with a pending attachment is dynamic delivery. URL verdicts evaluated at access time belong to SafeLinks, with Teams enabled explicitly. Question 26 of 45. After the pilot begins, the SOC wants a custom alert when users in Secure Collab Pilot report messages as phishing. One isolated report should not alert. 3 reports within 1 hour should. The SOC mailbox must receive notifications, but its members must not be added to the monitored pilot group. Analysts also need the triggering activity records preserved in the alert. Contoso wants the SOC mailbox notified whenever a user reports a message as malware or phishing. The team must use Microsoft Managed Detection logic, keep portal alerts enabled, and avoid changing anti-phishing or mail flow enforcement. No pilot-only threshold is required. What should the security administrator configure? Option A, create a custom 5-event threshold policy scoped to pilot users and disable the built-in policy. Option B, create a safe links policy that alerts whenever any user selects a rewritten URL. Option C, enable the built-in email reported by user as malware or phish alert policy and add the SOC mailbox to its notification recipients. Option D, add the SOC mailbox to the outbound spam policy notification settings. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Enable the built-in email reported by user as malware or phish alert policy and add the SOC mailbox to its notification recipients. The built-in email reported by user as malware or phish alert policy is the documented Microsoft Managed Detection for this event. Its recipient settings can route email to the SOC while preserving portal alerts and leaving the detection logic and mail protection policies unchanged. A custom threshold is unnecessary and is not a supported substitute for editing the built-in activity logic. When Microsoft already supplies the required alert type, preserve its detection logic and change only status or notification settings unless the scenario explicitly requires custom activity logic. Question 27 of 45. Litware enables SSPR for Secure Collab Pilot and requires 2 authentication methods for reset. Pilot users have registered 2 permitted methods. A cloud-only test user can reset a password successfully, but synchronized pilot users see the message that their organization has not enabled password reset. Password writeback is disabled in Microsoft Entra Connect Sync, and the tenant's on-premises integration setting for writing passwords back is also disabled. Users must continue to change their ADDS password through the cloud SSPR experience. What should the identity administrator configure? Option A, enable password hash synchronization only. The next synchronization cycle will reverse the new cloud password into ADDS. Option B, change the SSPR authentication method requirement from 2 methods to 1, because synchronized users cannot use 2-method reset with password writeback. Option C, enable password writeback in Connect Sync and the tenant, then verify the connector account's required ADDS reset and write permissions. Option D, convert the synchronized pilot users to cloud-only users before allowing SSPR, then recreate their ADDS accounts with the new passwords. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Enable password writeback in Connect Sync and the tenant, then verify the connector account's required ADDS reset and write permissions. For synchronized users whose authoritative password remains in ADDS, SSPR must write the reset to the on-premises directory. That path requires password writeback to be enabled in the Connect Sync configuration and in the tenant's SSPR on-premises integration settings, with the connector account delegated the documented directory permissions. Password hash synchronization flows password hashes toward Microsoft Entra ID and is not the reverse write mechanism. Follow password authority and flow direction. Hash synchronization is outbound from ADDS, while a cloud SSPR reset for a synchronized identity needs the separately enabled writeback path and directory permissions. Question 28 of 45. A phishing message was delivered to 180 mailboxes before its URL reputation changed. SafeLinks later blocked the destination, but 37 delivered copies remain in user mailboxes, and the security team needs an auditable tenant-wide remediation. The responder must verify recipients and delivery locations, remove only the matching messages, require review before execution, and track the approved action to completion. Which response should the responder use? Option A. Add the URL to the tenant allow block list and wait for safe links to recall every previously delivered message automatically. Option B. Verify the messages in Threat Explorer, submit a move or delete remediation for approval, and monitor it in Action Center. Option C. Run an attack simulation using the same URL and use the simulation report to delete the original campaign's delivered messages. Option D. Create an Exchange Online Mailflow rule that deletes messages with the original subject, because Mailflow rules retroactively process existing mailbox content and provide per-message approval. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Verify the messages in Threat Explorer, submit a move or delete remediation for approval, and monitor it in Action Center. Threat Explorer provides the message-level investigation surface needed to identify the campaign's recipients, delivery status, and locations, and to select the exact delivered messages. Remediation actions, such as moving or deleting selected messages, can be submitted through the review and approval workflow. An Action Center records and tracks the action's status. That preserves scope and auditability while separating investigation, approval, and execution. Blocking the URL protects future clicks but does not itself remove mailbox copies. Transport rules process mail in transit, and attack simulation measures user behavior rather than remediating a real campaign. For post-delivery email response, separate future protection from mailbox remediation. Use Explorer to prove and scope the message set, then use the approval workflow and Action Center to execute and audit removal. Question 29 of 45. Contoso's legal department must complete a Microsoft-provided social engineering course by quarter end. Legal prohibits sending simulated phishing messages to this population during the quarter. Administrators need completion tracking in attack simulation training and must send reminders to users who have not completed the assigned content. Which action should the security administrator take? Option A. Create an Exchange Online Mailflow rule that sends the training URL and use message trace to measure course completion. Option B. Create a credential harvest simulation. Assign training only to users who enter credentials, and suppress the payload email after launch. Option C. Create a simulation automation with no payload, and use the automation schedule as the training due date. Option D. Create a training campaign. Assign the required training to the legal department users, configure the due date and reminder notifications, and launch the campaign. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Create a training campaign. Assign the required training to the legal department users, configure the due date and reminder notifications, and launch the campaign. A training campaign assigns training directly, without first delivering a simulated phishing payload. It supports a campaign schedule, completion due date, and reminder notifications, while attack simulation training retains campaign progress and completion evidence. That mechanism satisfies the explicit no simulation boundary. Simulations and simulation automations are designed around social engineering payload delivery and outcomes. When the requirement is education and tracked completion without a phishing test, choose a training campaign. A simulation, or simulation automation, measures behavior by delivering a social engineering payload. Question 30 of 45. Fabricam uses Microsoft Entra password protection for cloud users and is extending the same protection to writable on-premises AD/DS domain controllers. Security has added company-specific terms to the custom banned password list. Before enforcement on premises, the directory team must deploy the required components with redundancy and collect evidence about passwords that would be rejected without blocking password changes. Match each requirement to the configuration or component that satisfies it. Each target may be used once. Some targets are not used. Requirements. R1. Add Fabricam-specific weak terms to the password evaluation performed with Microsoft's global banned password list. R2. Provide forest-level connectivity to Microsoft Entra and make the downloaded password policy data available to the on-premises domain controller agents without making each domain controller internet-facing. R3. Evaluate on-premises password changes and resets on each writable domain controller, but initially record would-be failures instead of rejecting them. Targets. T1. Deploy at least 2 Microsoft Entra password protection proxy servers per forest and register them. T2. Configure the custom banned password list in Microsoft Entra ID. T3. Install the proxy service only on an internet-facing read-only domain controller. T4. Enable password hash synchronization staging mode on every domain controller. T5. Install the DC agent on every writable domain controller and configure password protection in audit mode. Lock in your answer. The complete correct mapping is R1 maps to T2. Add Fabricam-specific weak terms to the password evaluation performed with Microsoft's global banned password list. Maps to configure the custom banned password list in Microsoft Entra ID. R2 maps to T1. Provide forest-level connectivity to Microsoft Entra and make the downloaded password policy data available to the on-premises domain controller agents without making each domain controller internet-facing. Maps to deploy at least 2 Microsoft Entra password protection proxy servers per forest and register them. R3 maps to T5. Evaluate on-premises password changes and resets on each writable domain controller, but initially record would-be failures instead of rejecting them. Maps to install the DC agent on every writable domain controller and configure password protection in audit mode. The tenant's custom banned password list supplements the automatically maintained global list with organization-specific terms. On-premises deployment separates roles. Registered proxy servers communicate with Microsoft Entra, download policy, and distribute it within the forest, while DC agents enforce or audit the policy where password changes and resets are processed. Microsoft recommends redundant proxy servers. Audit mode records whether a password would fail without enforcing the rejection, allowing evidence collection before switching to enforced mode. Decompose on-premises password protection by role. Tenant settings define custom vocabulary. Redundant proxies retrieve and distribute policy. And DC agents evaluate passwords locally. Audit versus enforce controls consequence, not policy content. Question 31 of 45. A finance mailbox was restricted from sending after Microsoft 365 detected a suspicious outbound mail pattern. Incident response has reset the user's password, revoked active sessions, removed malicious forwarding, and confirmed that the endpoint is clean. A messaging administrator then selects Unblock on the Restricted Entities page. 15 minutes later, a controlled test still receives 550 5.1.8, access denied, bad outbound sender, although the user no longer appears on the page. The tenant's outbound spam policies have not changed. What should the administrator do next? Option A, recreate the user in restricted entities and unblock the new entry to force policy replication. Option B, allow the documented propagation interval, retest outbound delivery, and escalate if restriction remains after the maximum interval. Option C, disable the alert policy named user restricted from sending email, because the alert keeps the transport restriction active. Option D, add the mailbox as an allowed sender in the anti-spam connection filter so the restriction is bypassed. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Allow the documented propagation interval, retest outbound delivery, and escalate if restriction remains after the maximum interval. The security prerequisites have been completed, and the service restriction has already been removed through the supported control. Microsoft states that removal normally completes within 1 hour, but transient issues can extend the total wait to no more than 24 hours. The user's disappearance from restricted entities is not proof that every transport component has converged after only 15 minutes. The defensible next action is therefore to preserve the remediated state, allow propagation, retest, and escalate if the documented maximum interval is exceeded, rather than introducing an unrelated mail flow exception. After a remediated user is unblocked through restricted entities, distinguish control plane removal from transport plane convergence. Disappearance from the page can precede restored sending, with a documented outer propagation interval of 24 hours. Question 32 of 45. Contoso is retiring a published sensitivity label named Acquisition Legacy after publishing its replacement. Thousands of files already carry Acquisition Legacy encryption and must remain protected and readable. Users must stop applying that label to new content, but compliance wants the label definition and its name-to-good history retained, so existing items remain intelligible in administrative explorers during the migration. Which action best meets the requirement with the least destructive change? Option A. Remove Acquisition Legacy from the applicable sensitivity label policies, but keep the label defined in the tenant. Option B. Remove encryption from the Acquisition Legacy label and leave it published until every existing file is relabeled. Option C. Delete Acquisition Legacy and then create a label with the same display name and encryption settings. Option D. Move Acquisition Legacy to the bottom of the global label order while leaving it in every current label policy. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Remove Acquisition Legacy from the applicable sensitivity label policies, but keep the label defined in the tenant. A label is made available to users by publishing it through a label policy. Removing Acquisition Legacy from those policies stops the label from being offered for new selections after policy replication, while leaving the label object and the protection already applied to content intact. Keeping the definition also preserves the GUID to name mapping used by administrative experiences. This is narrower and more reversible than deletion. Administrators should allow the documented replication period for the policy change before treating publication as fully withdrawn. Retiring a label has two independent levers: remove it from label policies to withdraw future selection, retain the label object when existing protected content and GUID to name audit readability must survive. Question 33 of 45. Network connectivity insights in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center show a poor assessment and a new network issue for Contoso's Singapore office. The office is already represented by correct LAN subnet information, and the tenant view has enough samples to establish that the issue is location-specific. The network team now needs endpoint-level measurements from inside that office to isolate whether local DNS, proxy traversal, or the network path to Microsoft's service front door is driving the assessment. What should the team do next? Option A. Run the network connectivity test from a representative Singapore endpoint and correlate its findings with the Office insight. Option B. Run Microsoft Entra Connect Health connectivity tests from the synchronization server because they measure the client path used by Microsoft 365 workloads. Option C. Use Message Center to identify the Microsoft 365 release that changed Singapore's network score. Option D. Delete and re-add the Singapore office so the tenant assessment is recalculated without its historical samples. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Run the network connectivity test from a representative Singapore endpoint and correlate its findings with the Office insight. The Admin Center insight has already supplied the population level signal and localized it to Singapore. Microsoft recommends using that insight together with the Microsoft 365 network connectivity test from the affected location. The test adds endpoint-specific detail and targeted improvement actions that can expose DNS, proxy, egress, and service front door path behavior. This preserves the Office's evidence and moves from detection to root cause diagnosis instead of resetting the measurement scope. Use network connectivity insights to identify the affected Office and comparative problem. Use the connectivity test inside that office to turn the aggregate signal into endpoint-level path evidence and a targeted action. Question 34 of 45. A label report shows that 12,000 SharePoint and OneDrive items carry the export-controlled sensitivity label. Internal Audit selects a sample of sites and requires a compliance investigator to verify the exact item locations and inspect the detected item contents. The investigator must not edit labels, policies, alerts, or cases, and merely seeing aggregate counts or item names is insufficient. Which access design best satisfies the evidence requirement with least privilege? Option A. Use Activity Explorer and assign Audit Reader, because activity events expose the current contents of every labeled file. Option B. Use the Label Report and assign Compliance Administrator, because Report Drill-Through requires policy management permissions to display item contents. Option C. Assign both Content Explorer List Viewer and Content Explorer Content Viewer through a custom Purview role group scoped to the Communications Administrative Unit. Option D. Use Content Explorer and assign only the Content Explorer List Viewer role, because list access includes a read-only content preview. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Assign both Content Explorer List Viewer and Content Explorer Content Viewer through a custom Purview role group scoped to the Communications Administrative Unit. Content Explorer separates inventory access from content inspection. Data Classification List Viewer exposes items and their locations. Data Classification Content Viewer adds in-place content visibility. The requirement needs both permissions, and a custom Purview role group can apply the administrative unit scope without granting case management or policy editing. Content Explorer separates discovery from inspection. List Viewer reveals which items and locations matched. Content Viewer is the additional privilege required to open sampled content. Question 35 of 45. Contoso uses Cloud Update in the Microsoft 365 Apps Admin Center for devices assigned to the monthly enterprise profile. For each new release, 60 validation devices must update first, and the rest of the profile must remain in later deployment groups. Operations also needs device-level evidence of rollout progress and update failures from the same management plane. The validation devices are represented by a Microsoft Entra group, but adding that group must not accidentally remove unlisted devices from update management. Which two configurations should the administrator use? Choose two. Option A. Use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center release preference for selected users to measure whether the Office installation succeeded on their devices. Option B. Configure rollout waves on the monthly enterprise profile, put validation devices in Wave 1, and leave others in the built-in final wave. Option C. Use update progress and health to monitor rollout and investigate device-level issues. Option D. Create a separate cloud update profile for every rollout wave and exclude each later wave from all earlier profiles. Option E. Move the validation devices to current channel, preview, because rollout waves can contain only devices on different update channels. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and C. Option B. Configure rollout waves on the monthly enterprise profile. Put validation devices in Wave 1 and leave others in the built-in final wave. Option C. Use update progress and health to monitor rollout and investigate device-level issues. Rollout waves subdivide eligible devices already assigned to the monthly enterprise cloud update profile. The validation Microsoft Entra group can be placed in the first wave, while the built-in final wave retains all remaining profile devices that were not assigned to an earlier wave. Group assignment to a wave is distinct from profile assignment. Update progress and health then supplies the profile's deployment status and device-level issue evidence. The answers are independent selections. Together, they provide controlled rollout and operational monitoring, not an answer order sequence. In Cloud Update, profile assignment answers which devices are managed, Rollout waves answer when subsets receive each release, the final wave catches remaining profile devices, and progress and health supplies deployment evidence. Question 36 of 45. Fabricam uses federation and hybrid Microsoft Entra joined Windows devices. After an ADFS change, affected users can complete interactive browser sign-in, but new Windows sessions no longer obtain single sign-on to Microsoft 365. A failed Microsoft Entra sign-in record for an affected session reports that the Federation service failed to issue an OAuth primary refresh token. Operations must identify the broken dependency before changing conditional access or resetting credentials. What should the identity administrator do first? Option A. Delete the affected devices from Microsoft Entra ID and immediately register them again, because browser success proves the Federation service can issue a primary refresh token. Option B. Use the failed sign-in's reason and details to identify and verify the Federation device authentication and synchronization configuration before retesting. Option C. Exclude the users from every conditional access policy and repeat the test, because a primary refresh token is issued only when no grant controls apply. Option D. Reset the user's password and revoke all refresh tokens, because a password reset causes ADFS to recreate the device registration object. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Use the failed sign-in's reason and details to identify and verify the Federation device authentication and synchronization configuration before retesting. The error is already scoped to the token handoff between the Federation service and Microsoft Entra device authentication, not to basic user credential validation. Interactive browser authentication succeeds, while issuance of the OAuth primary refresh token fails. Microsoft Learn directs administrators troubleshooting sign-in failures to preserve the event and interpret its failure reason and additional details. For this specific failure, those details point to verifying that device synchronization/device authentication is enabled. That evidence first check tests the dependency that can prevent PRT issuance without weakening access policy or destructively rebuilding device state. After correcting the federation or device sync configuration, the administrator should retest and correlate the new sign-in event. When browser federation succeeds, but the failed event explicitly says ADFS did not issue an OAuth PRT, troubleshoot the federation to device authentication handoff from failure reason and additional details before touching credentials, device objects, or access policy. Question 37 of 45. Contoso and Fabricam collaborate in a Teams shared channel owned by Contoso. Participants remain signed in to their home tenants through Microsoft Entra B2B Direct Connect. Contoso has a Teams DLP policy that blocks acquisition identifiers, but a Fabricam participant can post one of those identifiers. Contoso participants' matching posts are blocked. Contoso must prevent its own users from disclosing the identifiers without assuming administrative control over Fabricam's users. Which design correctly applies the DLP enforcement boundary? Option A. Keep Contoso's Teams DLP policy scoped to the relevant Contoso senders and require Fabricam to configure equivalent protection for Fabricam senders. Evaluate shared channel messages under each sender's home tenant DLP policy. Option B. Scope Contoso's Teams DLP policy to the shared channel owner so that Contoso's policy evaluates every message posted in that channel, regardless of the sender's home tenant. Option C. Add SharePoint and OneDrive as locations in Contoso's DLP policy, because those repository locations transfer Contoso's Teams message enforcement to Fabricam senders. Option D. Convert the shared channel to external access chat, because external access causes the host tenant's DLP policies to replace every participant's home tenant policies. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Keep Contoso's Teams DLP policy scoped to the relevant Contoso senders and require Fabricam to configure equivalent protection for Fabricam senders. Evaluate shared channel messages under each sender's home tenant DLP policy. Teams' shared channels use B2B Direct Connect, so each participant remains authenticated to the participant's home tenant, rather than becoming a guest object, governed as a host tenant sender. Teams' DLP evaluation for channel communications follows the sender's identity. Contoso's policies therefore govern messages sent by Contoso users, while Fabricam's policies govern messages sent by Fabricam users. Neither tenant can enforce its team's DLP policy on the other tenant's senders. Contoso can satisfy its stated responsibility by scoping and enforcing its policy for Contoso senders, and coordinating an equivalent Fabricam control where bilateral protection is required. Channel ownership and content repository locations do not move that sender-based policy authority. For cross-tenant Teams communications, identify who sent the message, not who owns the channel. Shared channel and external chat DLP follows the sender's home tenant. SharePoint and OneDrive govern shared documents, not foreign senders' message text. Question 38 of 45. A company must onboard 70 Windows Server 2012 R2 application servers to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Configuration Manager can deploy software and scripts to the servers. A pilot that ran only the tenant-specific onboarding script did not create a healthy sensor, although connectivity tests passed. The company wants the supported modern unified solution and a repeatable deployment sequence. What should the endpoint administrator deploy? Option A, Microsoft Monitoring Agent configured with an arbitrary log analytics workspace, followed by the Windows 11 onboarding package. Option B, install the down-level server unified solution. Apply the tenant onboarding package through Configuration Manager and verify it in Defender. Option C, only the Windows Client Group Policy Onboarding blob, because Windows Server 2012 R2 contains the same built-in Defender for Endpoint sensor as Windows 11. Option D, the tenant onboarding script first and the Defender for Endpoint installation package afterward, because tenant registration must occur before sensor installation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Install the down-level server unified solution, apply the tenant onboarding package through Configuration Manager, and verify it in Defender. Windows Server 2012 R2 does not have the modern Defender for Endpoint sensor built into the operating system. For the supported unified solution, the administrator must install the down-level Server Defender for Endpoint package and then apply the tenant-specific onboarding package. Configuration Manager is appropriate for repeatable deployment across this server population, and portal verification confirms that installation plus tenant registration produced a reporting device. The pilot's connectivity success only removes one dependency. An onboarding script cannot register a sensor that has not yet been installed. The older Microsoft Monitoring Agent path and client-only assumptions do not meet the stated unified solution requirement. On down-level Windows servers, separate sensor presence from tenant registration. Install the unified Defender for Endpoint server package first, then onboard. A successful connectivity test cannot compensate for a missing sensor. Question 39 of 45. An Intune managed Windows 11 engineering device is onboarded to Defender for Endpoint. Tamper protection and organization-managed Microsoft Defender antivirus settings are active. A signed compiler is being blocked on only this device, and the security engineer must temporarily change local antivirus settings to reproduce the behavior without weakening the production policy for the device group. After the diagnostic window, managed settings must automatically become read-only again and return to their policy values. Which action meets the requirement? Option A. Enable troubleshooting mode on the device. Make the authorized local diagnostic changes during its 4-hour window, and let policy restore afterward. Option B. Create a permanent process exclusion for the compiler at tenant scope. because tamper protection permits centrally configured exclusions to expire automatically after 4 hours. Option C. Place Defender antivirus in passive mode locally and uninstall the Defender for Endpoint sensor after collecting the compiler log. Option D. Exclude the device from every Intune antivirus policy, disable tamper protection tenant-wide, and manually restore the assignments after testing. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Enable troubleshooting mode on the device. Make the authorized local diagnostic changes during its 4-hour window, and let policy restore afterward. Defender for Endpoint troubleshooting mode is the device-scoped, time-bounded mechanism for diagnosing Microsoft Defender antivirus behavior when tamper protection and organizational policy normally lock settings. With the required permissions, an administrator enables it for one device. Authorized local administrators can temporarily change supported antivirus settings for testing. The mode lasts 4 hours. At expiration, policy-managed settings become read-only again and revert to their pre-existing managed configuration. This preserves central policy scope and creates a controlled diagnostic exception, rather than weakening the tenant, removing protection, or converting an unproven compatibility hypothesis into a permanent exclusion. For one-device antivirus diagnosis under tamper protection, look for a portal-authorized temporary write window with automatic policy reversion. Troubleshooting mode is scoped and self-expiring. Exclusions and assignment changes are durable policy decisions. Question 40 of 45. Fabricam migrated 900 acquisition employees to its Microsoft 365 tenant 45 days ago. All 900 received Microsoft 365 apps and Teams entitlements. The adoption team must determine whether desktop app deployment failed on particular devices and whether the same employees are actually participating in Teams. A licensing inventory alone is not acceptable evidence, and the two findings must remain distinguishable rather than being collapsed into one tenant-wide score. During the same review, security finds unfamiliar sign-ins for several migrated accounts. Fabricam has Microsoft Entra ID P2 for the workforce and intends to deploy automated risk-based protection only after observing its likely impact. Emergency access accounts must remain outside automated remediation. Which two usage reports should the adoption team correlate to obtain the required service-specific evidence? Choose 2. Option A. Adoption score, using only the aggregate tenant score as proof of each employee's desktop activation and Teams activity. Option B. Microsoft 365 apps active users, treating an app launch as direct evidence of Teams participation. Option C. Licenses, using assigned product entitlements as proof that each employee installed and used the desktop apps. Option D. Microsoft Teams user activity, using per-user meetings, messages, calls, and other Teams activity for the reporting period. Option E. Microsoft 365 apps usage, using its user and device activation details to identify installations and activations. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are D and E. Option D. Microsoft Teams user activity, using per-user meetings, messages, calls, and other Teams activity for the reporting period. Option E. Microsoft 365 apps usage, using its user and device activation details to identify installations and activations. The Microsoft 365 apps usage report provides the deployment side evidence. Activation and usage information can be examined by user and by device, so the team can identify employees or devices for which the desktop app deployment did not produce the expected activation. The team's user activity report independently measures Teams participation through user-level Teams activities over the selected reporting period. Correlating those two exports preserves the required distinction between desktop deployment and collaboration behavior. An assigned license establishes entitlement, not installation, activation, or use. The Microsoft 365 Apps Active Users report concerns use of Microsoft 365 apps and cannot substitute for team-specific activity. Adoption score can support broader adoption analysis, but an aggregate score does not provide the two service-specific, user-correlatable evidence sets requested here. When adoption diagnosis spans deployment and behavior, correlate the narrow service reports that expose each population. Do not infer use from entitlement or replace two evidence layers with an aggregate score. Question 41 of 45. Security wants medium or higher sign-in risk to require multi-factor authentication, and high user risk to require a secure password change. The team must validate real sign-in impact before enforcement, avoid combining two different risk conditions into one policy, and preserve both emergency access accounts. Which identity protection plan satisfies the requirements? Option A. Enable the legacy sign-in risk and user risk policies, then add a report-only conditional access policy that contains no risk condition. Option B. Create one conditional access policy containing both sign-in risk and user risk conditions, require multi-factor authentication and password change together, and enable it immediately for all users. Option C. Create only a high user risk policy that blocks access, because user risk automatically supplies the requested medium sign-in risk multi-factor authentication experience. Option D. Create separate sign-in risk and user risk policies with their respective controls, exclude emergency accounts, and validate both in report-only mode before enabling. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Create separate sign-in risk and user risk policies with their respective controls, exclude emergency accounts, and validate both in report-only mode before enabling. Microsoft recommends separate conditional access policies for sign-in risk and user risk, rather than combining both conditions. That separation lets Fabricam apply multi-factor authentication to the transient sign-in event, while using secure password change to remediate an identity whose accumulated user risk is high. Microsoft Entra ID P2 supplies the full identity protection capabilities assumed by the design. Narrow emergency account exclusions preserve recovery access, and report-only mode supplies observed policy impact evidence before enforcement. The alternatives either combine distinct conditions and controls, rely on legacy risk policies instead of the current conditional access design, or substitute a high user risk block for the explicitly required sign-in risk response. None preserves all of the scope, remediation, evidence, and recovery constraints. Plan identity protection by separating event risk from identity risk. Sign-in risk challenges the current access attempt, while user risk drives account remediation. Validate each policy before enforcement. Question 42 of 45. Before the planned policies are enforced, an investigator correlates a migrated cloud-only user's risky sign-ins with Defender evidence of a stolen session and unauthorized SharePoint downloads. The user confirms none of the activity. Security must record Microsoft's risk judgment as a true compromise, invalidate the attacker's current access, and restore the account with a new credential. The evidence must not be suppressed as a false positive. Which response should the investigator perform? Option A. Delete the individual risk detections, disable the planned user risk policy, and reset only the user's multi-factor authentication methods. Option B. Confirm the sign-in safe, require multi-factor authentication registration, and wait for Microsoft Entra ID protection to retain the current sessions until their normal expiration. Option C. Confirm the user compromised, block the user while containment is performed, revoke the user's sessions, and reset the cloud account's password before restoring access. Option D. Dismiss the user's risk, revoke the user's sessions, and ask the user to keep the existing password. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Confirm the user compromised, block the user while containment is performed, revoke the user's sessions, and reset the cloud account's password before restoring access. The correlated evidence establishes compromise. So confirm user compromised records that conclusion and moves the user's risk to high rather than suppressing the detections. Containment must address active access as well as the credential. Blocking the account during response and revoking sessions prevents continued token use, while resetting the cloud-only user's password replaces the stolen credential before access is restored. This sequence preserves the evidence classification and performs containment followed by credential remediation. Dismiss user risk and confirm sign-in safe are reserved for evidence judged benign. Using either would train or record the wrong outcome. MFA method re-registration alone does not replace the compromised password or invalidate sessions, and deleting detections would discard rather than correctly adjudicate the evidence. Adjudication and remediation are separate. Confirm verified compromise to preserve the risk verdict, then contain tokens and replace the compromised credential before restoring the identity. Question 43 of 45. A research organization has 240 SharePoint sites, but only sites classified as controlled research must require a phishing-resistant authentication strength. The site list changes frequently, and administrators already apply a container sensitivity label to classify those sites. The stronger requirement must be requested only when a user accesses a labeled site, rather than for all SharePoint Online access. The plan must also avoid attaching a claims challenge before an enforcing policy exists. Which implementation sequence should the architect recommend? Option A. Apply the authentication context directly to every current site first. Leave the related conditional access policy disabled, and later replace the direct assignments with the label. Option B. Configure the label to require a compliant device. Then create an Exchange Online authentication strength policy, because SharePoint obtains its tokens through Exchange. Option C. Target SharePoint Online as the cloud app in a conditional access policy. Require phishing-resistant authentication and exclude every site that is not currently labeled. Option D. Install the Unified Solution Package on each Windows Server 2012 R2 server. Then apply the Defender for Endpoint onboarding package. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Install the Unified Solution Package on each Windows Server 2012 R2 server, then apply the Defender for Endpoint onboarding package. Conditional Access Authentication Context supplies resource-level step-up enforcement inside a cloud service. The architect first creates and publishes the context, so supported applications can request it, then creates and validates the conditional access policy whose target resource is that context, and whose grant control requires the approved phishing-resistant authentication strength. Finally, binding the context to the existing container sensitivity label makes labeled SharePoint sites request that policy without maintaining a changing site exclusion list. This sequence establishes the enforcement side before attaching the claims challenge to production sites and preserves classification-driven scope. Targeting SharePoint Online itself is service-wide, while a disabled or absent context policy can break supported site operations without enforcing the intended grant. When only classified objects inside a cloud app need step-up access, target an authentication context rather than the whole app. Publish the context, establish its conditional access grant, then let the container label attach the challenge to resources. Question 44 of 45. Defender Vulnerability Management recommends upgrading an engineering runtime on 1,200 devices. The security team has prioritized the recommendation by exposed devices and active threats, but only the endpoint team may deploy software. The Microsoft Intune connection in Defender for Endpoint Advanced Features is off, so the remediation form offers no Intune security task option. A separately identified group of 80 laboratory devices must remain on the vulnerable version for 30 days under an approved documented risk acceptance. Those devices must not make the recommendation appear unresolved for the approved scope. Which two actions satisfy the operational and evidence requirements? Choose two. Option A. Enable the Intune connection, then create the recommendation's remediation request with an Intune task for the endpoint team. Option B, create only a Microsoft Defender XDR incident and assign it to the endpoint team, because incidents automatically become Intune security tasks. Option C, exclude the laboratory devices from Defender for Endpoint onboarding until the 30-day approval expires. Option D, create a time-bounded exception for the approved lab device scope and record the risk acceptance justification. Option E, mark the recommendation as resolved for all 1,200 devices before the endpoint team deploys the runtime. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and D. Option A, enable the Intune connection, then create the recommendation's remediation request with an Intune task for the endpoint team. Option D, create a time-bounded exception for the approved lab device scope and record the risk acceptance justification. The remediation workflow bridges security prioritization and IT execution. Enabling the Microsoft Intune connection makes the Intune security task option available when the security team creates a remediation request from the recommendation. The endpoint team can then execute and track deployment without giving the security team software deployment ownership. The approved laboratory population is a different disposition, not a failed deployment. A scoped, time-bounded exception with justification records the accepted risk and removes that approved scope from the active recommendation metrics for the exception period. Prematurely resolving the recommendation destroys truthful status evidence. Defender XDR incident assignment is not the Intune remediation task integration, and offboarding devices would sacrifice endpoint visibility merely to alter vulnerability reporting. Split vulnerability response by disposition. Use a remediation request and Intune task for work that must be performed, but use a justified expiring exception for risk that has formally been accepted. Question 45 of 45. Contoso is validating its Microsoft 365 app connector in Defender for Cloud Apps after a security coverage review. The connector was created before January 2026. Microsoft 365 activities are absent even after the documented ingestion delay, and Power BI contributes no audit events, although other connected workloads do. File policy scanning is not part of this validation. Match each established gap to the most direct corrective action. Each target may be used once. Requirements. R1. The connector predates the expanded default component selection and does not cover every currently recommended Microsoft 365 component. R2. No Microsoft 365 activity records reach Defender for Cloud Apps because the tenant-wide audit prerequisite is disabled. R3. Power BI activity alone is absent because auditing is disabled in that workload. Targets. T1. Enable auditing in Power BI. T2. Edit or reconnect the Microsoft 365 App Connector. Select all current default Microsoft 365 components and connect again. T3. Enable auditing in Microsoft Purview and allow the documented ingestion delay. T4. Enable Exchange Mailbox audit logging as the sole tenant-wide prerequisite for all Microsoft 365 workloads. T5. Activate a Defender for Cloud Apps information protection policy so organizational files are scanned. Lock in your answer. The complete correct mapping is R1 maps to T2. The connector predates the expanded default component selection and does not cover every currently recommended Microsoft 365 component. Maps to Edit or Reconnect. The Microsoft 365 App Connector, select all current default Microsoft 365 components and connect again. R2 maps to T3. No Microsoft 365 activity records reach Defender for Cloud Apps because the tenant-wide audit prerequisite is disabled. Maps to enable auditing in Microsoft Purview and allow the documented ingestion delay. R3 maps to T1. Power BI activity alone is absent because auditing is disabled in that workload. Maps to enable auditing in Power BI. Microsoft notes that connectors configured before the January 2026 default component update should be revisited. Selecting all current defaults and connecting again updates coverage. The Microsoft 365 connector consumes Microsoft 365 audit data, so tenant-wide auditing in Microsoft Purview is the prerequisite when no Microsoft 365 activities arrive. Ingestion begins after auditing is enabled and can take 24 to 72 hours. Power BI has its own auditing prerequisite, so an isolated Power BI gap is corrected in Power BI rather than by rebuilding unrelated connector components. Information protection policies govern file scanning and storage, which the scenario explicitly excludes. Exchange mailbox auditing affects Exchange mailbox activities. It is not the sole switch that enables audit events from every Microsoft 365 workload. The diagnosis must therefore map connector scope, common audit ingestion, and workload-specific auditing to their own configuration layers. Troubleshoot the Microsoft 365 connector in layers. Selected connector components define coverage. Microsoft Purview auditing feeds the common activity stream, and workloads such as Power BI can retain their own audit prerequisite. You finished MS-102 Set 2. Treat every miss as evidence. Group misses by service boundary, identify the constraint you overlooked, and answer again from the requirement. That practice builds Microsoft 365 administrator judgment. Thanks for practicing with WebLizard Cert Lab. Review the full exam clues, revisit week objectives, and continue with MS-102 Practice Exam Set 3 when you are ready.